Hello, good morning. Jesus Christ, I've been warned that the British audience post-Saturday night might be a bit low energy. I'm Dambisa Moyo. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I was here last year, actually as a speaker, but the horse has become the rider, and today I'm going to be interviewing, Neal Ferguson. For those of you who don't know Neal, which I'm sure is no one in this room, Neal is a world-renowned, respected historian. Full disclosure, I've known him for, I think, a good 15 years, which means that it actually means that it'll be much more aggressive than kind and nice. But in any case, Neal started his career here, Scottish, very proud Scotsman, who started his career at Oxford, earned a doctorate, spent a lot of time at Jesus College, also at Cambridge, and then decamped to the United States, went to NYU, spent a number of years at Harvard, and about a year ago, I guess, or maybe 2 years ago now, moved to greater climes to Stanford. Has written numerous books. The book we are going to be focused on mainly today is about networks, the square and the tower. And Neal will be available for book signing after the event, I will remind you. But I do have a few other housekeeping notes to mention here. First of all, you came in this door, but on exiting, please will you use the other door back there. And for people who are planning to come back into the next session, you do unfortunately have to come back through the route that you came in earlier on. 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of this discussion. Please get more excited, get more energized. I need you. So think about some hard questions that you want to ask Neal. And I think that was really it. And so welcome, Neal. Glad to have you here. It's a pleasure to be here.
Should I say that you're a really awesome economist?
Yes, please do say that.
Because I mean, let's just remember.
Oh, he's buttering me up. Save it for the judge.
I'm gonna do this because this is the art of networking. So she is an amazing economist, and her book Dead Aid really electrified the debate on aid to Africa. Yes. And full disclosure, I remember writing a foreword.
You sure did. And you know, it's 10 years on. January will be 10 years since that book came out. Yes.
So there. All right.
All right, on to the exciting stuff.
You can interrogate me now.
Yes, I will. I didn't bring my gloves. So, Neal, first of all, why did you write this book about networks? Does it smack of snobbery? What are networks? Tell us in your own words, and if you don't mind, just link it to the title of your book.
Well, the reason I wanted to write a book about networks was that I was halfway through writing the biography of Henry Kissinger. I'd done the first volume from 1923 to 1968, and I was trying to think of what the theme would be for the second volume that would take him through the Nixon and Ford years. And I realized that there was a puzzle. And the puzzle was, why did this obviously very intelligent man who'd made a great impact as an academic and a public intellectual become very powerful very quickly? He was really nobody at the beginning of 1969 in the eyes of the denizens of the swamp. He was some Harvard professor that Nixon had inexplicably appointed as National Security Advisor. The dying Eisenhower said, "What? You've appointed a professor? They're absolutely useless," which is not untrue by and large. And yet Kissinger by 1973 was regarded in the world's media as the most powerful man apart from the president, and as Nixon's power collapsed, in effect, for a time, Kissinger was really the most powerful man in the world. So the hypothesis for volume 2 was, it's because he was a consummate networker. He understood very well that what was changing in the world as the 1970s evolved was that it was no longer a world of hierarchies, of org charts, in which the guy at the top, and it was nearly always a guy in those days, simply issued orders and down the pyramid they traveled. Something was changing, and Kissinger instinctively understood this, which meant that having a network would be more valuable. And so he very quickly built an extraordinary network to the media, to press, also to Hollywood, and then to all kinds of foreign leaders, not always his official counterpart. So that was the starting point. And then I realized that I'd been writing about networks much of my career. I've written books about financial networks. My book on the British Empire is full of, has as its subtext that a network of Scots actually ran the British Empire. And which is true.
It wasn't that subtle, Neal.
I didn't say it was subtle, it was the subtext. And then I realized I'd been writing all these books about networks without properly understanding what a network is. I'd been using the word very casually, as in, we're going to go networking. So I thought I'd better give myself a crash course in the theory of networks. Stanford's a fantastic place to do that, because much of the cutting edge work in sociology and economics, in computer science, in neuroscience, has been done there. So I immersed myself in a very, very disparate literature and try to understand how exactly it is that networks function. And The Square in the Tower was a title that I had to come up with because they wouldn't let me call it Networks and Hierarchies, because the people on talk radio can't say the word hierarchy. So I had to come up with something else. And The Square in the Tower seemed to capture it, because if you go to a place like Siena, there's this wonderful square where everybody networks, and there's a market sometimes, there's a race sometimes people are just sitting around chatting. That's the realm of informal, decentralized networks. And then there's the tower right next to it, the Torre del Mangia, which is part of the Palazzo Pubblico, where power is located. And that's the starting point of the book, the fundamental tension between informal social networks and hierarchical structures of power.
So why do they exist? You touched on it a little bit, but your book sort of goes through a number of different places and times where hierarchies and networks have been incredibly influential, from Chinese revolts to European royalty. So just talk to us. Why is it that networks exist? And specifically, are they emblematic or symptomatic of a failure in government?
Well, in evolutionary terms, it's clearly innate to Homo sapiens to operate in larger social networks than our nearest relations in the primate kingdom do. So we have an exceptionally developed capacity for managing large social networks, which is deep in prehistory. Networks, therefore, social networks, have been there from the outset, just as in the same way that our neural networks were different from other species. And hierarchies are also there from the outset too, because although you have, in a typical hunter-gatherer community, a relatively decentralized social network, somebody has to be in charge, particularly when it comes to defense, because, and this is quite an important point for later in the book and in our discussion, while networks can be tremendously creative in that they empower the individual nodes in the network, they're not very good at self-defense, and therefore they're easily hacked. And so if you're going to be secure as a tribe from the other hunter-gatherers, you need to have some command structure. When the shit is flying, somebody needs to say, okay, you go out there and risk your life in the frontal attack. And the typical network won't be able to do that. So the story of the book, to cut to the chase, is that there's not really a dichotomy between social networks and hierarchies. There's more a continuum. It's better to say that everything that we're in is a social network, including this group of people. We could graph the social network of this room, if we could get the data from Zuckerberg, we would, which would be fascinating. Actually, we can now get it. You just need to be an average Ukrainian hacker. If we plotted the relationships between all the people in this room, it would be very interesting, because we would find that this is not a lattice. In no social network is there just a uniform number of edges between the nodes. You're all just nodes to me now. Since I read this stuff, I'm just like, nodes. But the fascinating thing is that when you graph a social network, there tends to be one node which has much higher centrality than the others. That is Andrew Roberts. Wait, no, Tina Brown is here. That is Tina, and more people will know Tina or Andrew than anybody else. And that I think is a really important insight. that you can graph any social network. You can find out about the relations, the edges between the nodes. It will never be a kind of flat thing. There'll always be one or a few nodes with much higher centrality, many, many more connections. The person you have to go through to get to the other people that you don't yourself know. And some networks are very hierarchical. In some networks, say Stalin's Soviet Union, there's just this one massively dominant node. And it's really dangerous, actually, to relate to one another other than through him, because he regards any social network he doesn't control as a conspiracy. That's a very hierarchical kind of network. And other networks are much, much more decentralized, where there really isn't one dominant node. And that's the right way to think about it. And any organization that you belong to, and some people here will work for big corporations, and some people will work for, say, academic institutions. When you ask yourself the question, what would this look like if we graphed it? That's a better question to ask than, where am I in the org chart? Which is such a 1950s question.
So I have to ask the question, we're going to take it from the macro to the micro. So you specifically, very successful, and here you are on the global stage. Could you talk to us a little bit about the specific networks that you are part of and how you got in there?
Well, I don't think of myself as very successful. I
Neither
failed.
do I, darling, but that's
I know.
okay, never mind.
I want to be. I became a historian. Faute de mieux. I tried almost everything else as an Oxford undergraduate and essentially failed. And after 2 years of failure, I realized I was only any good at writing history essays, and I better try and make a living from it. But at the beginning of the book, I try to spell out explicitly my own experience of social networks, because I think it's important to do a full disclosure on that. I talk a bit about the curious connections that led me from Oxford, where you first discover, as an uncouth Glaswegian, how the English operate, and after you've been crushed repeatedly by Etonians, dust yourself down from another snub, you begin to understand. Tone down the accent, Neal. Don't punch them so early in the evening. So gradually you understand how Oxford is a crucial, as is also true of Cambridge, an absolutely crucial hub in the network of the British elite. And once you have made it in there, then you find that there are networks within the networks. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the book, because one of the most famous disasters in the history of the British establishment was the hacking of the Cambridge network by the KGB, who brilliantly figured out that if they could hack the Apostles, one of the most exclusive networks in British intellectual history, then they would basically have access to the entire British governmental establishment, including MI6. So I'm interested in how you get from there through sometimes rather weak ties into other networks. So some of my contemporaries went down a well-travelled road which led from Oxford to the BBC, or from Oxford to Fleet Street, or from Oxford to the City. There were a series of very obvious avenues that you could go down, whereas I never fancied any of that. It seemed like too much work. And the vacations of academic life are essentially your ticket to freedom, and freedom has always mattered much more to me than anything else. So I stayed in academic life and found that I was part of a really exciting network that existed in the early 1980s, a dissident network of conservative academics in Oxford and in Cambridge who encouraged what I suppose were the more troublemaking undergraduates. Jeremy Catto, who recently sadly died at Oriel, was a huge influence on me. Then Norman Stone came from Cambridge to Oxford and was one of my doctoral advisors. That was a really important network because it was intellectually exciting to be part of it, to meet Roger Scruton for the first time, one of the great minds of modern British conservatism. The time I then spent at Peterhouse when I moved to Cambridge, that network was really important for me because although it was relatively small and always beleaguered, always under siege from a left-wing majority in academia, it was extraordinarily encouraging. One had this feeling that as one did one's first amateurish bits of work, there was a readership that was not just receptive to it, but would help you improve it. I mean, I remember sitting with Norman Stone running dissertation ideas past him. That's such a vital part of intellectual development if you're going down the academic route. And Norman would sit there and I would say things like, I know, how about satirical literature in late 19th century Vienna? And Norman would go, total detumescence.
But Neal, so here's the thing. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and this is extremely riveting. However, I'm
Thanks.
really, I really want
it was
to get
kind of fun.
to why should we care? So, I mean, you're being a bit coy and a bit opaque. You go to Bilderberg. Yes.
Not supposed to mention it.
You transitioned to the inner sanctum of not just the United Kingdom, but also the United States. That is what we're interested in. We're interested in what is going on in those networks. And I asked you a question earlier about this being a government failure. At a time where there's so much inequality in income, in politics, there's the massive issues in access. You know, the real skepticism about these networks is that there is something going on that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm sure it's wonderful to hear about Vienna and all that, but everything you're talking about is very past tense. I want to talk about now, looking to the future. There's a world of people who are skeptical of their definition of networks. Even though they exist in certain networks, they're skeptical of many of the networks that you're involved in. So could you just talk to us specifically about those?
Well, there is a connection, because once Norman had shot down all my original ideas for dissertations, and I had come up with the German hyperinflation of 1923, and that had not produced total detumescence, I became a financial historian. I worked on that subject for my dissertation. That was the subject of my first book. Then another networking bit of happenstance, George Weidenfeld called me up and suggested that I write a history of the Rothschild banks. And that was a kind of another critical moment in my career. So I spent a lot of time working on financial history. And as I did that, I noticed that Americans were more interested in financial history than many people in Britain. Because in Britain, there's still a view that if you're a historian, you should do at least one book on Henry VIII. And at least two on Winston Churchill. But, sorry. But
no fighting, boys.
couldn't resist it. But I thought bankers were interesting. I thought, actually, hey, there's a reasonable case to be made that and this seemed true from the first book I'd written, that the bankers were more important in Weimar Germany than the people who were in government. And writing the Rothschild history, it was clear that in the 19th century, and many people said it at the time, the Rothschilds were more powerful than almost any government except perhaps the British government. So I was working on precisely the question that you've raised. How powerful are the financial elites? Now, I noticed in some opinion polling while I was researching the Square and the Tower, half of Americans think, that the world is in fact controlled by a secretive elite. And 1 in 5 think that it's George Soros who has a plan to subvert the Constitution of the United States.
So hold that
20%.
thought. Can I just ask by show of hands, how many people in here think that there is a sort of shadowy city or sort of Illuminati type of group of people who are controlling commerce? No? Hands? No? This is true. Okay, out of the shadow. Anyone? No?
Some of them are in this room.
Fewer than I would have thought.
Well,
go
so
ahead.
here's the challenge that has been central to my career. It's clear that there really were these tremendous concentrations of capital in 19th and 20th century Europe, and that they had considerable influence and indeed at times power. But most of the things that get written about secret or powerful elite networks are by conspiracy theorists. And this is partly because mainstream historians don't really want to write about this stuff. Take for example, the history of the Freemasons. An enormous amount of the literature on that subject is by cranks. Or if you're writing about Jewish bankers, and clearly the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, about whom I also wrote, were Jewish, there's another whole conspiracy theory literature out there, and most of it's really, really terrible. It's just crazy in some cases, because you keep reading on the website and then it turns out that aliens control George Soros, and you're like, wait, you lost me at aliens. So most serious historians, I can remember talking about this with the late John Roberts at Merton. I mean, John wrote a book about the secret societies of the early 19th century, of the Restoration era. But when you read the book, it wasn't really about them at all. It was about the things that people had said about them. And I remember saying to him, but why didn't you actually write about the secret societies? Oh, I could possibly do that. And it turns out that it's really difficult to do. The Illuminati, fantastic conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, they even feature in Dan Brown. But they did exist. And there is, in fact, a serious, relatively new literature on the Illuminati, a kind of odd secret order of radical Enlightenment theorists in South Germany, which has been gradually pieced together by historians working in the archives of Masonic lodges. So the challenge is to write about this stuff without encouraging the conspiracy theorists. And that's hard to avoid. I remember discovering that my book on the Rothschild was extensively quoted in a huge Chinese bestseller about the extraordinary powerful financial elite that controls the world. The only difference is that in the Chinese context, that's thought to be really cool. I would go to China to talk about the book and say, now, Professor Ferguson, can you explain how we can do this?
Well, I think in this audience, I don't know about the audience, I certainly want to know how I can do this. Because
Well,
this to me is fascinating.
So then you're writing about this stuff. You're sitting in the archives thinking, turns out that when the chips were down, the Rothschilds couldn't prevent Bismarck from unifying Germany. They were wholly against him. They really didn't want him to do what he did. It cost them. They lost. So the book that I wrote back then was about the limits as well as the extent of financial power. At the same time, you're getting invited to come and talk to conferences of today's bankers. It becomes part of the edutainment at corporate conferences. Then the financial crisis happens, and everybody's running around like headless chickens. What happened, what happened, what happened? And the only people who know what's going on are people who studied the Great Depression. So you're called to even more of those conferences, and you spend more time with the people who are currently running major financial institutions, and then they say you should come to the Bilderberg meeting or you should come to the Trilateral Commission, so you go along. And my approach was, well, I'm not going to learn about how this all works sitting in my study in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So you go, partly out of curiosity.
So you're a Trojan horse, basically, is what you're telling us. Man of the people.
A Trojan horse would imply a far more subversive role than I have ever played, or at least the Trojans are still in the horse. I can't get the horse lid to open. But what do you discover? You discover when you go to any of these exclusive meetings where the network that rules the world congregates, and they are so not in control. I can remember the first time I went to one of the ones about which The Guardian likes to write nutty pieces. And I thought it was not long after the financial crisis had struck, and I remember thinking, if only people could see how completely not in control these people are. And then it was suddenly dawned on me, oh God, nobody's in control of the world. There is no secret elite that knows what it's doing. This is all improv. And that's the key insight. The conspiracy to rule the world may have been attempted, but it has failed pretty completely. We were at an event just last weekend, you and I, because she's part of it.
I'm just a simple African girl just trying to figure out what's going on.
This is all rigged.
I know nothing.
This is so rigged. So we are the globalists. If Steve Bannon were here, he'd be kind of foaming at the mouth. And we were at a super globalist event last weekend in, of course, Aspen.
I'm coming to that because I want to know where these places are, where these watering pools are.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to talk about that later.
Where we go. Davos. So there's the World Economic Forum. You know, your calendar gets pretty full after a while because, I mean, the global elite makes so many demands on your time. What, not another conference? I have not barely been at home. And then there's this new node of conspiracy, Cliveden, which has a long reputation.
Long reputation.
And it's kind of being revived by that sinister figure, Andrew Roberts. So you kind of go from place to place. And over the last 10 years, I would say the most striking feature of all of these events has been the manifest powerlessness and often cluelessness of the people at those gatherings. They didn't understand the financial crisis. Hey, what happened, man? My CDOs, like, they're worth 30% of what they were worth. They didn't understand that. They didn't understand the Arab Spring. They didn't understand the Arab revolutions. I can remember, I won't name him, somebody giving a long and careful explanation of why nothing would come of events in Tunisia shortly before they swept across the entire region, toppling regimes. They didn't understand the Eurozone crisis. The same people that we're talking about thought, oh, this is an American financial crisis, until it was, in fact, a much worse European financial crisis. And then they didn't understand the migration crisis, even though it was really predictable that after the failure of the Arab revolutions, there would be a mass migration crisis. So if I look back over 10 years of conferences at places like Davos and Aspen and the Villa d'Este in Chernobyl and all the places you and I meet, because we don't really have to make any social plans with one another. Just like, we just know we're going to see one another almost with a certainty at these places. And they always sit there having discussions that turn out between 6 and 12 months later to have been completely wrong. I love it because it's like this contrarian indicator. I especially love the polls they do. What are your big concerns? There's always the global political risk or the global economic risks, and I carefully note down the list of the things they're most worried about, knowing that none of those things will happen. And the thing that they have completely forgotten about is the thing that we'll be talking about next year, and then they'll all claim to have predicted it, even though they didn't. So that's the ghastly reality about the global elite.
Okay, well, Neal, you doth protest a little bit too much, but never mind. I want to talk about technology, the role of technology. It is something that now is being touted as being incredibly disruptive for democracy in particular. And if you think about democracy being sort of more square-like, there are real issues around what I would say is more hierarchy around this issue of technology. Could you just talk to us? You now live in Silicon Valley. What should we believe? What should we be worried about? Should we be worried? Democracy seems under siege. Talk to us about Facebook. It doesn't have to be specific about Facebook. It's about these institutions that have hundreds of millions of people, billions of people as subscribers. What is their power? What is their influence? And again, what should be the role of the government?
Well, that was partly my motivation for writing the book, because when I moved to Stanford 2 years ago, I was astonished by how indifferent to history people in Silicon Valley were. I mean, history, if you are a Google person, began with the Google IPO. And everything before then is like the Stone Age. Why would you even bother thinking about it? And the feeling that they'd made the world anew, which kind of began in the mid-90s, but just carried on after the dot-com bust, resumed with the advent of the network platforms, that's the kind of thing that to me is a flashing red light. It really reminded me of the mood in Wall Street in 2005-06. Oh, we have had the great moderation. We've solved all the problems of macro. We're so smart. Our financial technology is so awesome. And I'm like, you guys are heading for the cliff edge. And that was why I wrote The Ascent of Money, which came out just a few weeks before Lehman blew up. And I think called right what was going to happen. The same feeling came upon me 2 years ago in Northern California. The same hubris, the same arrogance, and the same indifference to history. So the key argument the book makes is you should not be surprised to find that if you take social networks and make them really huge and really fast by creating network platforms like Facebook, then you shouldn't be surprised if all the pathologies that we find in smallish or medium-sized networks are replicated on a huge scale.
Such as?
One of the characteristic features of a social network is the phenomenon of homophily, or birds of a feather flock together. Most social networks, even if it's just the network of friends at a school, will tend to have a kind of self-segregating quality to it. This is very obvious in American high schools, where no amount of school integration could stop kids in the 1970s from self-segregating into racial clusters. That, by the way, still goes on. So, number one, if you create a really large social network, take Twitter, for example, if you look at the graph of retweets in the US, conservatives retweet conservatives and liberals retweet liberals, and there's almost no traffic between the two clusters, which are extremely dense. So point number one, we shouldn't have been surprised that the network platforms exacerbated the existing polarization, especially when the algorithms were designed to optimize for user engagement. And people are engaged not by truth necessarily, but by things that are just, hey, interesting, the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. Was such an interesting story in 2016. It was one of the top stories. It kept coming up. If you did Google search for a time, it was great, except for one small thing, it was untrue. And this was the second thing that we should probably have seen coming. There was perfectly good research in relatively small social networks showing that truth didn't necessarily spread faster through a network than falsehood. There's a good historical example of this, actually. And this is a central analogy to the book, the impact of the printing press on 15th, 16th, 17th century Europe. At the beginning, everybody thought it'd be awesome if everybody could be connected via printing, and it'd be much easier to produce content and much easier to distribute it. And Martin Luther, rather like Mark Zuckerberg, thought this would be great. We'll have the priesthood of all believers. And two things happened. First, the segregation that I've described. Half of Europe, people like me, said, "Oh, you are right, Martin, but you don't go nearly far enough." And then everyone in Southern Europe is like, "You're a heretic, Luther. We're going to burn you." And that was the basic Reformation, counter-Reformation thing, the classic pattern where the network polarizes. But the other thing that you see in the 16th and 17th century is that crazy stuff goes viral even more than Luther's sermons. And the craziest stuff then was, "There are witches amongst us." "Oh, yeah. Oh, she is so a witch." Yeah. Well, how do you know? "Oh, I just know. I believe her. Burn her." And that's the witch craze, which sweeps the Protestant parts of Europe and gets across to North America. So I think they should have been, the Silicon Valley utopians should have been far more aware of the dangers of creating these enormous online networks than they were. Instead, we were given endless amounts of Kool-Aid. In a world that's connected, everything will be awesome. And I get that all the time still. That is the mantra of Silicon Valley. Only gradually, because I think mainly of the 2016 election, has it sunk in that these giant network platforms are a menace. And not just because of the polarization, not just because of the fake news problem, but also because, as I mentioned earlier, networks are really insecure. And they're just not very good at self-defense, particularly because of the decentralized distributed character of them. And yet again, another example just in the last, 24 hours, that Facebook has just been hacked again, with hackers having access to Facebook accounts, including, I'm told, Zuckerberg's. So this is a very, very dangerous world that we've created for ourselves. We were lulled into a naive belief that if we were all connected, it would all be wonderful. And now we wake up and discover that democracy has had its operating system changed. And many people in this country too don't yet understand that Facebook advertising changes everything in democracy. Because you each get your tailor-made advertisement, and you may not even know that it's an advertisement, and I don't know what they're sending you, because you're going to get different content from me for sure. That has changed the structure of politics so profoundly that most people, including eminent political scientists, don't get it, and they keep talking about their old models that use polling data, and I'm sitting there going, you haven't understood. The game has changed.
Are you on any social media platform?
I was forced onto social media by two forces in my life, my children and my publisher. Publishers want you to be on social media to sell more books, and my children initially wanted me to be on social media because it was cool. my daughter said, "You need to be on Facebook, Dad." This was way back in the early days of Facebook. And I sneeringly said, "Oh, do I?" And then I realized, oh, then I can find out what they're up to. So this is how these things work. So I went on Facebook and I sent friend requests to my daughter and her two brothers. And the boys, being, sweet boys, immediately accepted my friend request. My daughter never did. So far smarter. So I was sucked into these platforms under those pressures. And now I've had to build a kind of mental hygiene wall around myself, because not only are they disruptive of democracy, they're disruptive of sanity. And if you haven't had your sanity in any way undermined by social media, I congratulate you. It is extraordinarily difficult to withstand the addictive powers that these apps were designed to have. And so I think the only way to remain sane is to use them with infrequency, never to look at what people say about you. That's really vital. I actually hardly ever look at Facebook now, because I think Facebook is of all of them the worst and the one that poses the biggest danger. So I don't think I've looked at my Facebook pages for 6 months. But the magnitude of the structural change in the public sphere is still, I think, underestimated by most people. When I came to talk about the book, when it was published late last year, it was published first here in the UK, I remember doing a simple calculation, number of followers on Facebook and Twitter of major British politicians. And I found, to my amazement, that almost nobody was aware of how many more followers Jeremy Corbyn had than any major Conservative. It was 4x at that time, 4 times more than any Tory politician. And that matters much more, that stuff matters much more than people realise. It was the only predictor of Trump's victory. The opinion polls led people to expect with ridiculously high confidence a Clinton victory. But if you looked in social media, he was far ahead of her on Facebook, far ahead of her on Twitter, far ahead of her in Google search. He was searched far more for, even in blue states, than she was. Social media were telling you that Trump was going to win, but if you were listening to the usual suspects with their usual models, you completely were duped. So I'm very struck by the fact that all over the world there is this huge transition. Can I mention Jürgen Habermas?
Yes.
So, Jürgen Habermas war ein sehr wichtiger Philosoph. No, he was a very important German philosopher, man of the left. I'm much more left-wing than people realize. Essentially, I'm a Marxist on the side of the bourgeoisie. And Habermas, who was a man of the left, wrote a brilliant dissertation entitled Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, the structural change of the public sphere, talking about ways in which the public sphere had changed in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's the key conceptual framework you need here. There's been a structural change of the public sphere. It's no longer about newspapers or television or radio, the things you're accustomed to using for news. It is now about the social network platforms. And they operate in such a different way that most people are still lagging far behind. The people who get it, the people like Steve Bannon, or Dominic Cummings, who was in many ways faster to see this than anyone in the US, the people who get it have tremendous power until everybody else catches up. And that's why the two great events of 2016 in the English-speaking world, Brexit and Trump's victory, are better explained in terms of a structural change in the public sphere than by any other theory I've heard.
So what are you predicting now? By the way, 5 minutes before I'm opening it up to questions, please prepare yourselves. But what are you predicting now? You have the Tory conference, Brexit right on front and center. Is social media telling us anything about where people are? Do they want a second referendum? What should we take away from?
I don't think a huge amount has changed since the autumn, in the sense that Corbyn is still a dominant figure on social media. And therefore the message of last week's Labour conference is resonating with many more people than I think the polls would suggest. I think the polls are deceptive here, and they're lulling Conservatives into a false sense of security about what will happen if an election happens early. And so my read of this is be very, very afraid. If you think, as I do, that Jeremy Corbyn would be a disastrous person to have as Prime Minister, you should be very, very worried indeed.
So in my mind, it's very clear what the issues are with networks. You've talked about homogeneity, you've talked about splits and schisms between and polarization among people, but I'm still not clear about what we can do about it. What should we do about it? Is this something that we should adopt a laissez-faire attitude to? What can governments do?
Well, governments are already doing quite a lot, except not the US government. The European Commission has been aggressively going after the big tech companies, not only
in
with
what ways?
fines
Can you just
and
talk
taxes.
a little bit?
Well, I think what's
what
interesting
sort of
is that the Commission is setting the pace in the Western world when it comes to data portability regulation. I think much that the Europeans are doing is wrong. In particular, the tendency of the Germans to delegate censorship to the social networks. We'll fine you if you don't keep hate speech off the platform is a really bad policy because it increases the power of these companies. There was a time when the companies had a roughly libertarian philosophy. There were a whole bunch of engineers eating pizza, and they didn't really care. As long as it wasn't like terrorism and child porn, everything else would be fine. That has all changed. The social justice warriors have graduated. They've started working at Google. They now work at Facebook, and it's like, oh, that is such hate speech. What Ferguson just said there, we absolutely have to make sure that that lecture does not appear on page 1 of the search results. That stuff is going on, and the Europeans seem intent of actually legitimizing Silicon Valley's censorship policies, which are called community standards. So the Europeans are taking the lead. Of course, the Chinese have their own thing going on, which is a whole subplot that I talk about in the book. The assumption that Xi Jinping has that the big tech companies will be subordinate to the party and will make all user data available on demand to the party. That's a really interesting model. It's certainly consistent with one-party rule. It offers the possibility of totalitarianism 2.0 with total surveillance. That's what the Chinese are going for. The big puzzle, the unresolved question is what is going to happen in the US where the big tech companies are domiciled. There is, I think, a rapidly changing mood here. When I first published the book, and indeed 6 months later, it was still very hard to get Republicans in Washington to realize that there was a problem. Because their default setting was, we're Republicans, we don't do regulation. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. You absolutely have to do something. Because there will never be 2016 again. They're not going to help you ever again. In fact, you may be in for a complete, what was the word Obama used, shellacking, in November of this year, because now the social media companies are aggressively skewing content to the left. So finally, that penny dropped. It took a while between Charlottesville and the InfoWars Alex Jones ban, but now people have woken up, and there's a fascinating debate going on about how to regulate the big tech companies. Some people want to break them up, that's the antitrust line of argument. Some people want to regulate them as utilities, which I think was what Steve Bannon had in mind. I favor a different approach in which you remove their exemption from liability for the content that appears on the platform. That's a strange exemption that goes back to the mid-1990s, when most of these companies didn't exist. And this is crucial, you have to mandate that they uphold First Amendment rights. Because they are now the public sphere. They're not just private companies. They can ban whomever they please. They should now be required to uphold First Amendment rights. I think that approach is more elegant and more consistent with a market.
Do you want to just say what the First Amendment right is? Because I think
the right of free speech.
Yeah, just to be clear. This is moving a little bit away from the idea of networks, but I just want to underscore a couple of things. So overnight, Eric Schmidt has talked about there being 2 platforms of internet.
Two internets.
2 internets. So you've talked about China, but he's also talked about the US one. I think that throws up a whole lot of other questions. I mean, the questions about data privacy, individual rights, freedoms, etc., versus what's going on in China, I think are a big deal. You know that if you look at the sort of arc of history, we've only had liberal democracy for about 1% of the total time of humanity, and really only about 30% of the world's population has actually enjoyed the benefits of liberal democracy. So in a world where China's rising, they're much more aggressive. I mean, they're just not only in terms of politics and democracy, but in terms of innovation on medicine, education, engineering, AI, and some of the stuff that Kai-Fu Lee has been talking about. You know, what should it seems to me we should be worried sitting in the West. And I just, you know, I think that it would be great to just, in closing with you before we open it up, just to hear about how likely some of these revolutionary reforms that you're talking about will occur. I mean, what needs to happen? Does the Republican Party need to lose really badly for them to say, gosh, this is really traumatic? We do need to water our ideological views a bit and start becoming much more regulatory based. What needs to happen to trigger these things?
I think that debate has begun. Yeah. It probably will intensify if they do badly in November. But I don't think there's any possibility that the status quo can remain as it stands. It would be disastrously destabilizing for the United States if we didn't change something. The bigger question which we need to concern ourselves with is indeed the new Cold War. That is to say, the new arms race between the United States and China. There are only two people in this race, not only in terms of artificial intelligence, but in terms of quantum computing. The most chilling presentation I heard this year was at one of the kind of conferences we were talking about, was by a Google person, and he described, he's German, so it sounds better in a German accent, the quantum supremacy. So quantum supremacy is when one power achieves the quantum computer to a high level of functionality. At that point, there is no encryption anymore.
That's right.
So the quantum computing race is potentially much more destabilizing than the AI race, where the US and China are neck and neck pretty much in artificial intelligence. The Chinese have an inbuilt advantage with AI because they have a very, very large data set already from their large population. They also have no privacy restraints on what companies can do with the data. And because they allow online payments to grow much more rapidly than in the US, they've got much better processing, very high volumes of digital transactions. So here's the key. Europe is just a non-player in this game. And that means that in some ways Europe is between a rock and a hard place. You know, do you want to cozy up to the Chinese? Or do you just accept the hegemony of Silicon Valley? That's a really huge question for Europe. And as I've said, although I see some signs of life in the Commission, I do think that the basic framework that Vestager is using is misconceived, and that broadly speaking, when Europeans think and talk about these issues, they're very poorly informed as a rule. They come off as kind of dumb if you're used to hanging out with the people in the Valley. Eric Schmidt was somebody who was very helpful when I was writing this book. I needed somebody in the inside to read the book and make sure that I hadn't got it wrong. And he gave a fantastically patronizing verdict to me. He said, "Oh, Neal, I was really surprised. You actually understand this." I didn't expect that at all.
Okay, well, let's, some questions, please. We have two microphones coming around. Please, will you state your name? It's not for networking purposes. It's just so that we know who you are. I'm going to take two or three questions in a bunch so that we can try and get as many as possible. And by the way, can we focus on questions, not comments? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Wang. I wonder what you think about the blockchain.
Great question. Where's the other microphone? I think there are two of them floating around somewhere.
Andre, you seem to suggest that there's a symmetry between truth and falsehood. And in a graph theoretic sense, that can't be true.
I'll take one last one.
Hi, I'd like your, Amanda, I'd like your opinion on the companies like 23andMe that are holding individuals' genetics, especially in the context of the ownership structure of that company and potentially its ambitions.
Super. Thank you very much. 3 great questions. Over to you, Neal. You got them down?
I do.
Blockchain. Okay, fantastic.
Rachel, blockchain is, for those who are not following this, essentially a technology that allows a distributed ledger of information to exist. It's not centrally housed, it doesn't require third-party verification, and in theory, and mostly in practice, it can't be hacked and altered. So
Can you say that in English? What is a distributed ledger?
So,
I'm like,
so the first, I suppose, operationalized version was Bitcoin. And the idea was that here would be a digital money that would not require a central bank or any other authority to say this transaction is good. The transactions would simply be recorded in a large electronic ledger that all users would have a copy of. And each transaction would update the ledger, and there would be a self-verifying process. So that's roughly how it works. There have been a whole succession of experiments with what people now, I think rather misleadingly, call cryptocurrencies. Ethereum, which was the kind of next thing to come along, is really a platform on which you can build a whole bunch of different cryptocurrencies. The simple answer to the question is that I think money is the wrong use, or as they like to say, use case for blockchain. There's a variety of reasons for this, but the most obvious one is that this is a really inefficient way of paying for things. It may prove to be a store of value. Bitcoin is, I suppose, on probation as a store of value, but it doesn't look likely to be a unit of account because of its extraordinary volatility relative to other forms of money. So there are other uses for blockchain that are more plausible, where you don't require high-speed transactions. For example, there are some experiments going on, I think, in Estonia, where health records, or I think in another once communist country, Georgia, land title records are being stored in the blockchain. So there are lots of experiments going on around the world to try to find what is the optimal use for this. And my hunch is that data storage is more plausible than money, and that we'll probably look back and say that the whole experiment with blockchain-based money was a bit of a wrong turning. Andre's question. It's not that truth and falsehood are the same. It's just that in a network that's designed to disseminate information, it turns out that, and there's a good paper that was done at MIT after the Square in the Tower was published, it turns out that false stories can travel further and faster than true stories in a network optimized for user engagement. And this is a very powerful effect, and it's worth saying that part of any regulatory overhaul has to look at the ways in which the algorithms are designed, because that's secret. I mean, that's the secret sauce of the way these companies operate. So I think the problem we have at the moment is that the natural advantages that truth has in the familiar environment of this post-scientific revolution world of free inquiry, which we all, those of us who went to university, we all grew accustomed to, that world in which truth tends to win because of the whole apparatus of experimentation, the whole ways of replication, the ways we have over time since the scientific revolution evolved an academic network that favors truth over falsehood. These are fundamentally challenged by the algorithms used by the social networks. And at this point, the online networks are kind of winning. And this is really troubling. If you're interested in that issue, Sam Lessin, Lessin, is one of the most thoughtful writers on this subject. who publishes long essays in something called The Information, and Lesson, who was at Facebook. There are lots of, the interesting people in this debate are often ex-Facebook people, the sort of Facebook exiles, who are the ones who can critique the network platforms with real insight. I hope that answers your question. And finally, I don't know enough about 23andMe, so I can't answer that question.
Oh. Okay, well, I just got my 23andMe results, so I'll be happy to discuss them offline. I think we can get
You're
one
Scottish,
more round.
right?
Can't you tell? We'll get one more round of 3, and then I think I'll probably call it a day.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Desmond, where have all the statesmen and women gone?
Statesmen and women.
Where's the leadership?
Yes. Okay. Are we taking some more questions?
Yes, I said two
Just
more.
on Facebook, I guess I'm just wondering whether actually WhatsApp is the most concerning, because
Yeah.
it's obviously private and you've got the end-to-end encryption, so it's difficult to see how you regulate to overcome those issues.
Yeah. Great.
And this gentleman here has had his hand up for a while. Thank you.
So, like you not being, Christopher, not being a conspiracy theorist, is there such a thing in the United States as the deep state?
3 great questions, 5 minutes.
Plenty of time for you, Neal.
Let me take them in reverse order. The deep state was a phrase that only a couple of years ago one heard most often in the Middle East, or one heard it in Turkey. And the idea was that no matter who was officially in charge, no matter who was president, there was a deep state of army and bureaucracy that actually ran the country. Now, we had our own version of this in Britain called Yes Minister, which is much less sinister than the deep state, but it's essentially the same idea. Being British, we had to have fun about the idea that, in fact, unelected bureaucrats run the country. For some reason, we find that funny, and everybody else thinks it's really bad. So, tells us something about our national character. Sir Humphrey. The deep state had a battering in the Arab revolutions, and it's had a battering in Turkey under President Erdogan, and it's actually a striking feature of the last 10 years that the original deep state is greatly weaker than it was. But even as that was happening, the phrase began to be used in populist websites and in populist blogs and in populist chat rooms with respect to the United States. It's analogous, or sort of synonymous rather, with the swamp. And the idea is that no matter how many electoral votes Donald Trump received, actually unelected bureaucrats, not to mention lobbyists, run Washington, D.C., and therefore the federal government. And this turns out to be true. We know it's true because an anonymous op-ed appeared in the New York Times saying that it's true by somebody who works for the deep state. It was the only day Alex Jones didn't have to make up the content on InfoWars. Because the curious thing is that it turns out that just as much as Britain has Sir Humphrey, the US has its own version of the deep state. And it's only surprising that people are surprised. I'm shocked to discover that gambling is going on in Rick's in Casablanca. And I'm shocked to discover that President Trump and his team are not in complete control of the federal government. There are 63 different agencies in the federal government. They are mostly staffed by career people. The political appointees are a minority. I have met with political appointees in the administration, and they tell the story every time you see them of how extraordinarily difficult it is to get things done when the American version of Sir Humphrey is just taking the document off the desk before you sign it. So that's the deep state. And long may it continue, because believe me, we need the deep state. It's the only thing that stands between us and democracy. Andrew used to wonder why I wasn't as Eurosceptic as him and why I supported Remain in 2016. I always said that the democratic deficit was the thing I liked most about the European Union. Facebook is not just Facebook. Facebook, because nobody even thought about antitrust for years, while Facebook was acquiring WhatsApp and Instagram, they were kind of asleep at the Department of Justice. It's probably possible, it's likely, I think, that there'll be a fresh look at those decisions, because it does seem hard to justify those acquisitions. They've been crucial for Facebook, because if Facebook were just Facebook, it would have much more serious problems, as younger users are fleeing now deeply uncool Facebook. WhatsApp has a particularly malign role in South Asia, where it's used to circulate nutty conspiracy theories and inflame communal mistrust and violence. And that stuff is, in terms of lives lost, much worse than the things that we've talked about so far. If you want to see another example of how social media are doing real harm, the role that they've played in Myanmar is very shocking. And Facebook has been extremely slow to respond to criticism of its role in Myanmar. Finally, with no minutes remaining, where are the statesmen and women? No idea. No idea. I think one of the questions that we need to all ponder is how far the power of online social media, of network platforms, combined with an already quite polarized politics, has created an atmosphere in which nobody with any self-respect, any concern for their families, would wish to enter the domain of politics. The way in which Brett Kavanaugh was treated in recent weeks is an illustration of a new and, to my mind, malignant era in which due process, rule of law are swept aside and replaced by the trial by Twitter culture. Allegations can be made on the basis of 30-year-old memories and immediately transmuted by a combination of partisan politics and social media into truth and reputations destroyed. You can, of course, take the view, as I do, that sexual violence is a horrific thing. I just wish the Democrats in the US Senate had paid more attention when my wife testified last year on that subject, pointing out that the biggest threat to women's rights in the world today is not sexual harassment by American men. It's the spread of Sharia law into ever larger jurisdictions. When Ayan testified a year ago, the Senate Democrats, including Kamala Harris, ignored her, refused to ask any questions on the subject, and I think thereby exposed themselves as hypocrites. So here's the problem we have. One can justly feel, and I think it's true, that a revolution in manners is necessary in the way in which men and women relate to one another and the way in which men behave towards women. But to prosecute this revolution in the ways that it is being prosecuted, to use social media as a tool of character assassination, is the biggest deterrent I can imagine to the next generation of potential leaders. It is essentially saying, abandon hope, ye who enter the democratic process, for at some point, someone will try to, and very probably succeed in destroying your reputation. I hate to end on a somber note, but you did ask where the statesmen and stateswomen are, and I think there's a pretty good reason why the standard of leadership in Western societies has been in decline. Who would want to get into the snake pit that we've created?
Well, before we all disband, please remember you can get a copy, signed copy of Neal's book just outside here. But all that's left for me is to thank you, Neal. We could have spent another hour, I think, talking to you and asking you more questions. But it's been a real pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed the session. And thank you so much for your time.